The first gunshot didn't sound like it does in the movies. It wasn't sharp or cinematic or heroic. It was hollow, heavy, like the ceiling itself had cracked. And for one strange, disbelieving heartbeat, I actually thought it was thunder rolling through the city again, because we'd had storms all week, and the air had that wet, electric stillness that made everything feel on edge, like the whole world was waiting for something terrible to happen. I was carrying a tray of half-empty wine glasses when it happened, and one of them shattered against the wall before I even realized it wasn't thunder. And I stood there, frozen, staring at the spreading red stain on the white tablecloth, like my brain couldn't quite decide if it was wine or blood. And then I heard the second shot. Closer, sharper, and the screaming started. The private dining room was supposed to be off-limits to staff, but every waitress in that place knew better. When men like those came in, the kind who wore suits that cost more than our rent and smiled like wolves with blood on their teeth, you didn't argue, you didn't ask questions, you just served, smiled, and prayed they left before midnight. And tonight, they had taken the entire back room, ordered expensive whiskey, rare steaks, and asked for the music to stay low. I'd been in the kitchen, wiping down a counter, when I heard the first muffled laugh, the kind that made your skin crawl. And then, only minutes later, the sound of betrayal breaking glass and bone. I should have run. God, I should have run. But curiosity, or maybe fear dressed up as duty, rooted me to the tile floor, and through the crack of the swinging kitchen door, I saw it all. A scene I would never forget, no matter how many nights I begged my brain to forget it. The man at the head of the table, him. The one I'd noticed the moment they walked in, the one with eyes like gunmetal and a presence that made the room bend around him. He was standing now, his hand pressed against his abdomen, his white shirt blooming red, his chair knocked over behind him. Around him, 3 men, the same ones who had laughed at his jokes, toasted to his power, were now pointing guns at him. One of them said something I couldn't hear over the roaring in my ears, but whatever it was, it made the wounded man laugh, a low, dark sound that sent a shiver straight down my spine. It was the kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had already accepted death, but refused to let it take him quietly. And then just for a second his eyes lifted, searching, wild, and found mine. It was absurd, impossible, terrifying, but I swear he looked at me, like he could see me through the narrow crack of the door, through the shadows and the smoke curling above spilled whiskey. And for one blinding instant, the noise fell away, and the only thing I heard was his voice, quiet, deep, hoarse with blood. Stay quiet, and don't move. I froze, my breath trapped somewhere in my chest, my heart trying to claw its way out. The men turned on each other next, shouting, arguing. The one closest to the door flinched when Adrian— I didn't know his name yet, not then, but I would come to whisper it like a prayer and a curse later. Pulled a knife from the table and drove it into a throat. Blood sprayed across the linen, and the lights flickered as if the room itself couldn't bear to watch. The others fired, more glass shattered, and I stumbled backward into the kitchen, the tray clattering to the floor. For a long moment there was silence, just the sound of rain tapping against the back windows, the drip of blood pooling under the swinging door, and my own shaking breath. Then came the groan, low, rough, and far too close. I didn't think, I just moved. He stumbled through the door like a ghost, one hand pressed hard against his wound, the other gripping a gun slick with blood. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes feral, the kind of man who had lived too long in the dark and didn't trust the light anymore. He looked at me like I was both a threat and his last chance to live. "Help me," he said, voice barely a whisper. "Now." I should have screamed. I should have run to the phone, to the manager, to anyone. But I didn't. Instead, I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as I pressed down on the wound with my apron, the fabric soaking through almost instantly. Don't talk, I murmured, though I didn't know why I was the one giving orders. Maybe it made me feel less like prey. Maybe I was trying to convince myself this was still just a job, still just a night at work that had gone wrong. He looked at me. Really looked. And for a second I saw something human flicker behind those storm-gray eyes, something fragile and furious, and utterly unbreakable. "They're coming back," he muttered, and his head fell back against the tiles. "Don't let them find me." The words hit like gunfire, because that was the moment I realized the shooting wasn't over. The others were still in the hall, their voices low, their footsteps heavy, searching. I glanced toward the back door, then toward the walk-in freezer. "Can you walk?" I whispered. He didn't answer, but his hand gripped mine. Hard enough to hurt. Hard enough to mean yes. We moved like shadows. I half-dragged him, his weight heavy and unsteady against me, through the narrow hallway lined with crates and wine bottles, every step echoing like a scream. Behind us, someone kicked open the kitchen door. "Find him!" My pulse thundered. I yanked open the freezer door, the rush of cold air biting at my face, and pulled him inside. I shut it, held my breath, and waited. The footsteps passed. Voices cursed. A gun clicked. Then silence. Inside the freezer, the light was harsh and blue-white. Frost clung to the metal walls, and my breath came out in clouds. I could feel his heartbeat through the blood-soaked shirt, slowing, fading. His body trembled with pain, but his eyes stayed locked on me. "You should have run," he whispered. "You don't know what you've done." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool. But in that moment, I couldn't leave him. "I wasn't going to let you die out there," I said, my voice shaking but sure. He studied me, a long, unreadable look that made me feel like he was memorizing my face, etching it into the part of his soul where trust used to live. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "Then you're already in it." I didn't understand what he meant then. Not fully. But I would. Soon enough. Because when the sirens started outside, and the blue lights flashed against the restaurant windows, I realized that helping him wasn't an act of kindness. It was a choice. A dangerous, irreversible one. And as I pressed my hands harder against his wound, feeling his blood warm against my skin, I knew that whatever life I'd had before, the girl who served tables, who smiled politely, who believed the world was simple, she was gone. The man bleeding on my floor wasn't just a victim. He was something far worse. And by the time I found out who he really was, it would already be too late to walk away. When the sirens finally faded, and the blue flashes stopped staining the walls, I realized I hadn't breathed properly in what felt like hours, though time had become something strange and elastic, stretching and folding over itself in that cold, humming freezer where the world outside didn't seem entirely real anymore, where it was just me and the man whose blood painted my hands like a crime I hadn't yet confessed to. He'd passed out not long after the last car pulled away, and for a while I thought he was dead, his body unnaturally still, his skin pale as the frost collecting on the shelves behind him. And I sat there on the hard tile floor, my apron soaked through, whispering things I didn't even remember saying, prayers I didn't believe in, pleas that sounded like lies, anything to fill the silence that pressed down on me like the weight of a collapsing ceiling. I should have left him there. I know that now. I should have walked out, wiped my fingerprints from the door, and called it a night like none of it had ever happened, like I hadn't just watched a man fight death with a knife in his hand and a look in his eyes that said he'd rather drag hell up to the surface than surrender to it. But I didn't leave. I stayed. And that was the moment everything I thought I knew about myself began to unravel, slow and deliberate, like a thread being pulled from the edge of a dress until there's nothing left but the truth beneath it. Raw, exposed, impossible to stitch back together. When he stirred, It wasn't gentle. He came back like a man waking from war, gasping, eyes wide, reaching for a gun that wasn't there. I flinched, instinct, taking over, pressing my hands against his chest to hold him down, whispering, "You're safe," though I wasn't sure either of us were. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and assessing, and for a heartbeat I saw confusion flicker there, maybe even vulnerability. But it vanished beneath something colder, harder, control snapping back into place like a blade sliding home. "Where are we?" he rasped. "The freezer," I said. "In the restaurant. I didn't know where else to." "Anyone see you?" "No, I don't think so." He let out a breath, slow and heavy, his gaze darting to the metal door, the small porthole window that showed nothing but darkness beyond. His hand went to his wound, fingers brushing the rough fabric I'd tied around it. And when he looked back at me, there was something almost unreadable in his expression, a mix of disbelief and irritation. "You stopped the bleeding," he said, like he was accusing me. "I tried," I murmured. He studied me again, and in the harsh white light, I saw him properly for the first time. Not just a man covered in blood and shadows, but someone carved from a life of power and violence, someone who carried danger like a scent, faint but unmistakable, clinging to every breath he took. His hair was dark and damp with sweat, his jawline sharp and unyielding, his lips pale but stubbornly curved in defiance of death. Even half dead, he looked untouchable. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now but still edged with command, like he didn't know how to speak any other way. "Lena," I said. "Lena what?" "Just Lena." He almost smiled, not kindly but like I'd said something that amused him in a way it shouldn't have. "You've got guts, just Lena," he muttered, leaning back against the wall. "But guts get you killed in my world." I wanted to ask what that meant, what world he was talking about. But before I could, he winced and hissed through his teeth, blood blooming through the makeshift bandage again. My stomach turned, and instinct overruled fear. I reached for the first aid kit that hung on the freezer wall, one I'd never noticed before tonight, and began cleaning the wound properly, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the metallic tang of blood. He watched me, silent, eyes following every movement, and I tried not to notice how steady his breathing became as I worked, how his body relaxed slightly when my hands brushed his skin, how absurdly intimate it felt to be this close to someone whose name I still didn't know, whose life was written in secrets I couldn't begin to read. When I finished, I sat back, hands trembling. "You need a hospital," I said quietly. "No hospitals," he replied instantly, his tone flat, final. "You'll die if you stay here." He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw it. That darkness that wasn't just about crime or violence, but about conviction. About the kind of certainty that makes a person dangerous because they believe their own rules more than anyone else's. "I've died before," he said. The words chilled me more than the air ever could. We stayed in silence after that, both of us listening for footsteps that didn't come. My body ached from the cold, from fear, from the weight of what I'd done. I wanted to believe that morning would fix it, that somehow this night would fade into something survivable. But when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, deliberate, and terrifyingly certain. "They'll come looking for me," he said, "and when they do, they'll come for you too." My throat went dry. "Who?" He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "The ones who betrayed me." I swallowed hard, the reality of it settling like lead in my stomach. "Why would they come for me? I don't even know you." "That's the problem," he said. "You do now." He tried to stand but stumbled, and before I could stop myself, I caught him. His arm heavy across my shoulders, his breath warm against my neck. Every part of me screamed that this was insane, that I was crossing lines I didn't even know existed. But I guided him out of the freezer anyway, through the darkened kitchen and out into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The city muffled by rain and exhaustion. I half-carried him down the street, every step heavier than the last, until we reached my car. A beat-up little sedan that looked far too innocent for what it was about to be part of. He hesitated at the passenger door. "You sure about this?" "No," I said honestly. "But I'm doing it anyway." He gave me a look I couldn't decipher, something between warning and gratitude, then sank into the seat, closing his eyes as if surrendering, just for a moment, to the inevitability of it all. I drove through the city like a ghost, headlights gliding over rain-slick pavement, every red light feeling like a dare from the universe to stop before it was too late. But I didn't stop. I drove to my apartment. Small, old, tucked above a second-hand bookstore that smelled like dust and forgotten dreams, and helped him inside. Down the narrow hallway, into the room that had never held anything more dangerous than my own loneliness. I laid him on the couch, covered him with a blanket, and stood there staring at him. At this stranger who'd brought blood and ruin into my life in a matter of hours. And I should have felt terror, or regret, or even disgust. But instead there was something else blooming in the quiet between us. Something that felt like inevitability wearing the mask of choice. He opened his eyes just once before sleep took him. His voice low, rough, but certain. "You shouldn't have saved me, Lena." And maybe I should have listened. Maybe I should have understood that the decision I made in that freezer wasn't mercy but madness, wasn't compassion but a binding contract written in blood. Because as I watched him sleep, the sound of rain still tapping softly against my window, I realized that every heartbeat from now on would echo back to that moment. The night I saved a man who wasn't meant to be saved. And outside, in the dark, somewhere far too close, someone was already watching my building. Morning didn't come gently. It bled in through the thin curtains like a guilty secret, pale and cold, crawling over the walls of my apartment and settling on everything it shouldn't have. The couch where he lay half dead and unmovable, the floor still faintly marked with footprints from the rain, the discarded bandages that looked like confessions I'd forgotten to hide, and me, standing there barefoot with the heavy taste of sleeplessness coating my mouth, staring at a man I didn't know yet couldn't seem to walk away from. I told myself that once he woke up, I'd make him leave, that I'd done enough, that saving him from bleeding out in the freezer was one thing, but harboring him here, in the fragile silence of my small world, was something else entirely. Something reckless. Something that could ruin me. But when I saw the rise and fall of his chest, the shallow rhythm of his breath, and the ghost of pain etched between his brows even in sleep, I knew I was lying to myself again. Because I wasn't waiting for him to leave. I was waiting for him to open his eyes. The city was already alive outside, the hum of early traffic, the distant bark of street vendors, the faint grind of the subway beneath the pavement, all of it so ordinary that it almost mocked the chaos that had rearranged my life in a single night. And for a few strange moments, I stood there trying to pretend it was still my world, the one where the biggest danger I faced was a rude customer or a broken plate. But that illusion cracked when he shifted, groaned, and murmured something in a language I didn't understand, his hand twitching toward the place where his gun had been. I crossed the room slowly, kneeling beside him, my hand hovering just above his shoulder, unsure whether to touch him or not. And before I could decide, his eyes snapped open, sharp, gray, and terribly awake. For a heartbeat, the air between us froze, his gaze flicking over me like a weapon searching for intent. And I saw it again. That split-second instinct, that predator's clarity. Before it softened, recognition seeping in like light through cracks. You brought me here, he said, his voice rough, lower than before, thick with exhaustion and disbelief. And even in that rasp, there was authority, the kind that made you listen even when you didn't want to. I couldn't leave you there, I said quietly, feeling suddenly small in the gravity of his presence, though it was my apartment, my rules, my decision that had kept him alive. He tried to sit up, winced, then leaned back with a sharp breath, pressing a hand against his side where the blood had soaked through again. You should've, he muttered. You have no idea what you've done. I wanted to tell him I knew, that I understood this wasn't a fairy tale, that people like him didn't just vanish from the world without consequences. But the truth was, I didn't know anything. Not really. All I knew was that he was hurt, hunted, and alive because of me. And for some reason that last part mattered more than all the warnings bleeding from his voice. What happened? I asked, my words fragile in the space between us. Back there, in the restaurant. Who were those men? He studied me for a long time before answering, as if deciding how much truth I could survive. People I trusted, he said finally, each word measured, cold. People who forgot who they were dealing with. I swallowed, the weight of his tone pressing down on me, heavy and deliberate, like the sound of a door locking. They tried to kill you. They almost did. He looked away then, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on nothing, and for the first time I saw something human beneath the steel. Not weakness exactly, but weariness. The kind that comes from living too long with ghosts that never leave you alone. I should call someone, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow, ridiculous. A doctor, maybe. No doctors, he cut in, his tone sharp enough to make me flinch. No police, no hospitals, no one. You call anyone, you're dead, and so am I. The certainty in his voice sent a chill through me, not just because of the words, but because I believed him. So instead, I went to the kitchen, boiled water, and made coffee, my hands moving on instinct, because doing something ordinary was the only way to stop the world from spinning. The smell filled the air, bitter, grounding, and when I handed him a mug, he took it without a word, watching me over the rim as he drank, his gaze so heavy it felt like a touch. You live alone, he said, not a question. Yes. He nodded once as if confirming something to himself. That's good. Good? I asked, my voice trembling before I could stop it. Why is that good? Because it means no one else can get hurt. He said it so simply, so calmly as if violence was just another inevitability of living, and I felt something twist deep inside me. Fear, curiosity, something in between. Who are you? I asked finally. He looked at me for a long time before answering, and when he did, it wasn't a confession so much as a warning wrapped in exhaustion. My name is Adrian Moretti. The name didn't mean anything to me at first, just another name, another man. But there was a shift in the way he said it, a quiet gravity that made the air feel thicker. And then, as if on cue, memory kicked in. Whispers I'd overheard in the kitchen, headlines glimpsed on the news, stories about a family that wasn't really a family but an empire, one built on blood and money and silence. I started, my throat dry. Yes, he said simply, saving me from finishing. The Don, the head of the Moretti Syndicate, the man whose name people didn't say out loud. I stared at him, my heart hammering, my pulse echoing in my ears, and in that moment, every instinct screamed that I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But he didn't threaten me, didn't demand loyalty or silence. He just looked at me, tired, pale, bleeding, and said quietly, almost gently, "You saved me, Lena. That means they'll come for you too." I wanted to argue, to tell him that wasn't fair, that I didn't ask for any of this, that I was just a waitress who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but deep down I already knew it was true. The world didn't forgive witnesses, and the men who'd tried to kill him wouldn't let anyone who'd seen them walk away. "What do I do?" I whispered. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking on mine with the kind of intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You hide me," he said. "You keep quiet. You don't tell anyone. And when I'm strong enough, I disappear, and you pretend this never happened." There was no plea in his voice, no gratitude, only a calm command that made it sound less like a choice and more like fate. I should have said no. I should have told him to get out, to take his blood and his danger with him. But instead I nodded, because something in his voice, that impossible blend of threat and trust, made it impossible to do anything else. He leaned back again, closing his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under. And for a long time I stood there watching him, the name Adrian Moretti echoing in my mind like a spell I didn't understand. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights cutting across the window, and I caught a glimpse of a man standing in the shadows, his face half hidden beneath a hood, his posture too still to be innocent. And that was when it hit me, really hit me, that this wasn't a nightmare I could wake from, that the moment I opened that freezer door I'd stepped into a story that didn't have an exit. The dawn of the Moretti family was bleeding on my couch, and the people who wanted him dead had just found me. He woke up before dawn, though I wasn't sure he had slept at all, because every time I closed my eyes through that long, breathless night, I could still feel his presence filling the small apartment like a storm contained inside walls too thin to hold it. Could still hear the slow drag of his breath. Could still sense that strange awareness that hummed between us even in silence. A tension that wasn't quite fear but something sharper. Something alive. When I walked into the kitchen, the world outside was still ink black. The sky bruised with the last traces of night. And he was already there, sitting at my table, his back straight, his shoulders squared, his hand resting beside a cup of coffee that I hadn't made, which meant he'd helped himself, which meant he'd moved through my home, my safe, small space, like it already belonged to him. The sight of him there, still pale, the bandage under his shirt spotted with dark red, his hair damp from where he'd washed his face in my sink, the edge of a gun resting near his elbow like a promise he couldn't let go of, sent a shiver down my spine, not because he frightened me, but because he didn't seem entirely real, like something pulled from the fever dream of the night before and left behind to haunt the daylight. For a moment I just stood there, barefoot and unsure, watching him as the faint gray light crept across the table, softening the edges of his face but never quite touching the hardness in his eyes, the kind of hardness that didn't come from cruelty alone but from survival, from years of fighting to stay alive in a world that didn't forgive hesitation. He looked up at me then, his voice rough but steady when he said, "You need better locks on your door." I blinked, still half asleep, trying to understand whether it was advice or criticism, and he continued before I could answer. "The window near the fire escape. Anyone could get in. You should fix that." "I'll add it to my list," I murmured, though the only list I'd ever kept before now had things like groceries and laundry on it, not lessons in how to survive the aftermath of saving a Mafia boss. He almost smiled. That subtle, dangerous kind of smile that wasn't about amusement but recognition. Like he saw the fear flicker across my face and found it both predictable and unnecessary. "You're still here," he said. "You didn't run." I thought about it, I admitted, because lying to him seemed pointless. But I figured if I ran, you'd just find me. His gaze lingered on me for a long time, unreadable, and then he said, "You're smarter than you look." I should have been offended. But the way he said it, flat, unfiltered, matter of fact, made it sound almost like a compliment, and that realization unsettled me more than his gun ever could. He gestured to the other chair. "Sit." The word wasn't a request. It was a command, but a quiet one. So soft it almost felt like an invitation. I sat, partly because I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, partly because I was, and partly because every part of me was curious about the man sitting across from me, the man I'd saved, the man I should have let die. He studied me as I poured myself coffee, his eyes following every movement, calculating, assessing, as if trying to decide whether I was a liability or an anomaly. "You don't ask many questions," he said finally. "I don't know which ones won't get me killed," I replied before I could stop myself. That earned me another of those faint, almost human smiles. "Fair." We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind that hums beneath the surface like an unspoken secret. The coffee tasted bitter, but I drank it anyway, because it gave me something to do with my hands. He broke the quiet first. "You said your name's Lena." "Yes." "Do you live here alone?" "Yes." "No family?" I hesitated. "Not close by." He nodded once, like that was the answer he expected, and then leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table, slow and rhythmic, like he was listening to thoughts I couldn't hear. "Good," he murmured. "It's easier that way." Easier for what? He didn't say, and I didn't ask, though the question burned on my tongue. Instead, I asked the one I couldn't hold back any longer. "What happens now?" He looked at me for a long, unbroken moment, his eyes unreadable, and then said, "Now I heal. You keep quiet, and you pretend I was never here. I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted softly. "You will. Because if you don't, they'll find you before they find me." There was no threat in his voice, only truth, which made it even more terrifying. I set my cup down carefully, because my hands had started shaking. "Who are they?" He didn't answer right away, just stared past me, his gaze fixed on something distant, something only he could see. "My men," he said finally, and the way he said "my" was heavy with bitterness. "The ones who decided they wanted what was mine. Your men?" He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "In my world, loyalty is a currency, Lena, and like all currency, it loses value when greed takes hold." The way he said it, calm, cold, absolute, made me realize that whatever had happened in that restaurant wasn't just betrayal, it was an act of war. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, just watched him, trying to understand how someone could carry so much danger in their silence. He shifted slightly, wincing at the pain in his side, and I stood instinctively, moving toward him. "You should lie down," I said, but he shook his head. "I've spent too many years lying down, waiting for other people to fix things," he murmured. "I'm done waiting." There was something almost tragic in his defiance, something that felt older than he looked, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I wanted to help him. Not because I believed in him, but because I wanted to believe there was still a way out for both of us. "You need rest," I said again, softer this time. He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment the space between us shifted, became something electric, fragile, impossible. "You talk to me like I'm human," he said. I blinked. "What else would you be?" He didn't answer, just smiled faintly. That dangerous, quiet smile that made my stomach tighten. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with something I didn't have a name for. I should have looked away, should have stepped back, should have remembered who he was, but I didn't. I just stood there, caught in that impossible pull, until he finally broke the silence. "Don't make the mistake of thinking I'm one of the good ones," he said softly. "You save a man like me, and he takes you with him, even if he doesn't mean to." "I already did," I whispered. He leaned forward then, his eyes narrowing slightly. Not in anger, but in understanding. And for the first time since I met him, He looked less like a ghost, and more like something dangerously alive. "Then God help you, Lena," he said quietly, "because you've chosen a side, and it's mine now." Outside, a car door slammed, sharp and close, followed by footsteps on the pavement below my window. His head snapped toward the sound, instincts firing before logic, his hand gripping the gun on the table so fast it barely seemed real. He looked at me, not with fear, but with command. "Stay quiet," he said, his voice low, the same words he'd spoken the night I met him. "And don't move." And just like that, I knew. Whatever fragile safety had existed in this tiny apartment had vanished, replaced by the cold, inevitable truth that the world outside had finally found us. The footsteps outside didn't fade like they were supposed to. They lingered, slow and deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to someone passing by, but to someone who had come looking, someone who already knew where to stop. My heart began to beat in that strange, stuttering rhythm that felt like it was trying to warn me, to shout at me that this moment was the line, the one I couldn't uncross no matter how much I might want to later. And I remember glancing toward Adrian, whose face had gone still in that way dangerous men do when they're listening more than thinking. His eyes narrowing, his entire body tense but eerily calm, as if violence was a second language and silence the grammar that came before it. He motioned for me to stay where I was, one finger raised, a quiet command that needed no words, and then he moved. Not with speed, but with precision. Every step calculated, every breath measured. He didn't limp this time, though I could see the effort it took him, the way his jaw tightened, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. And as he reached the window, he pulled the curtain back no more than an inch, his eyes flicking toward the street below. For a few heartbeats, he said nothing, and I stood there barefoot in the middle of my kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough to leave marks on the wood, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Because the silence felt like a blade pressed against my throat. Then finally he spoke. "They're watching," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. I swallowed hard. "Them?" He nodded once, eyes still fixed outside. "One of mine. Or he used to be." He let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward me, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. "We can't stay here." "I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Pack what you need, nothing that ties you to this place. They'll come through that door within the hour." There was no panic in his voice, no hesitation, only certainty. And that made it worse because when someone like him said something like that, you didn't doubt it. You obeyed. I moved without thinking, pulling clothes from drawers, a few bills from the coffee jar, my mother's locket, a faded photograph I couldn't seem to leave behind. Adrian watched me the entire time, silent, steady, like he was making sure I wouldn't freeze. When I stopped, he nodded once, took my bag, and slung it over his uninjured shoulder. "We leave through the back." "What about the front? They'll be waiting there." He said it as simply as if he were telling me the time. I followed him, my pulse racing, my mind screaming at me that this was madness, that I was walking deeper into something I didn't understand. But my body kept moving anyway, drawn by the strange gravity that surrounded him. A pull that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the fact that, even bleeding and hunted, he felt like the only real thing in a world that suddenly made no sense. The alley behind my building smelled of rain and rust, the ground slick beneath our feet, the sound of the city muffled by fog. We moved fast, turning corners, keeping to shadows, and every few steps he'd glance behind us, eyes scanning, muscles taut. When we finally stopped, it was behind an old warehouse by the river, the kind of place no one looked at twice. He pushed the door open with the back of his hand, revealing a space that smelled of dust and gasoline, lit only by the faint light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. "This will do," he murmured, and for a moment, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard, the effort of the last few hours catching up with him. I set my bag down, my nerves frayed and raw, and turned to him. "What now?" He looked at me like the question itself was unnecessary. "Now we wait." For what? For me to be ready. His words hung in the air like smoke, unclear, heavy, but inevitable. I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but the exhaustion hit me all at once, the adrenaline ebbing away until all that was left was the shaking, the realization of what I'd just done. Left my home, my life, everything I knew, for a man whose world was built on danger. I sank down on a wooden crate, rubbing my hands over my face, and when I looked up, he was watching me again, that same unreadable gaze, but softer now, maybe even curious. "You're handling this better than most," he said quietly. "I'm not handling anything," I whispered. "I'm just trying not to fall apart." He nodded as if that was the only reasonable response. "You'll get used to it." "Used to what?" "To running." Something in the way he said it, flat, resigned, broke something in me. Or maybe it just cracked open a part of me I hadn't known was there. A part that understood too well what it meant to keep moving, to live your life looking over your shoulder. After a while, he walked toward a dusty cabinet, pulled out a half-empty bottle of vodka, and poured 2 uneven glasses. "Here," he said, handing me one. "It won't fix anything, but it helps with the noise." I took it, hesitated, then drank. It burned all the way down, sharp and unforgiving, and for some reason that felt right. He watched me, a faint smirk playing at his mouth, the first real expression I'd seen since I met him. "Not bad for a waitress," he said. "Not bad for a dead man," I shot back before I could stop myself. He laughed then, a low, rough sound that filled the empty space, the kind of laugh that shouldn't have fit a moment like this but somehow did. It was dangerous, beautiful, and alive. "You're not afraid of me," he said, almost like an accusation. "I am," I admitted, "but not enough to run." His eyes darkened, that quiet storm gathering behind them again. "That's worse," he murmured. "Fear keeps you alive. Whatever this is, it doesn't." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the vodka on his breath, the faint trace of smoke and something else beneath it, something sharp, clean like winter air. My pulse stuttered, and I told myself to move, to step back, to breathe, but I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, not sure for what. He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face, the touch surprisingly gentle. "You should have left me," he said softly. "I couldn't." His hand lingered a second longer before he dropped it, turning away, his voice colder now. "Then you need to understand something, Lena. Everyone who gets close to me burns." "I'm already burning," I whispered, and the words came out before I could stop them, quiet and trembling, but true. He froze for just a moment, his back still to me, and then, without turning around, he said, "Then drink up. You'll need it." The rest of the night passed in a haze of silence and vodka and unspoken things. He sat by the window, his gun within reach, watching the river like it held the answers to everything. I watched him, the sharp angles of his face in the dim light, the way he seemed both here and somewhere else entirely, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt safer with him there, even knowing he was the reason I wasn't safe at all. When I finally closed my eyes, my last thought was that maybe safety had never been the point. Maybe this was what it meant to be, alive, to stand too close to the fire and wait to see if you survived the heat. And somewhere outside, hidden in the fog, a car engine started. Low, slow, deliberate. Adrian heard it first. His eyes met mine across the dim room. "They found us," he said. The sound of the engine wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It rolled through the quiet like thunder hidden beneath the earth, low and certain, the kind of sound that didn't just announce danger but promised it. And before I even had time to think, before my mind could wrap itself around the fact that it wasn't imagination this time, Adrian was already moving, fluid and precise, the way a predator moves when the hunt has come too close to his den. He didn't speak at first, didn't need to, because everything about the way he moved told me what was happening. The quick flick of his wrist as he checked the gun's chamber, the slight tilt of his head as he listened to the rhythm of footsteps outside, the faint narrowing of his eyes as he mouthed one word to me, quiet as a ghost. "Down." I dropped behind the crate instinctively, my body trembling, every sense on fire. And I could feel the pulse of the night around us. The damp air, the faint echo of water against the dock outside, the slow, methodical approach of someone who thought they were invisible. But Adrian wasn't like other men. Danger was his oxygen. And I swear the moment the footsteps reached the door, the very air shifted, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what he would do. The first man through the doorway didn't even see him. I did. Or at least I saw the movement, fast and deliberate, a flicker of shadow that became violence before my eyes could catch up. There was a muffled sound, not a gunshot, but something heavier, intimate, final. And then the thud of a body hitting the floor. Adrian's face didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't even breathe differently. He was all control, all purpose, his expression carved into something unreadable and distant. And I realized in that terrible, hypnotic instant that I wasn't watching a man defend himself. I was watching a man reclaim himself. A man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of survival until it looked like poetry. Another shadow at the door. Another heartbeat. Another sound. And then silence again. The kind that makes you afraid to even exist inside it. I pressed my hands against my mouth, the copper scent of blood drifting through the air, and part of me wanted to scream, to run, to demand to know what kind of monster I had dragged into my life. But another part of me, the quieter, darker part I hadn't known existed until that night, couldn't look away. He turned then, meeting my eyes in the half-light, and for the first time I saw the truth of what he was. Not just a man who killed to survive, but a man who had to survive. No matter the cost. No matter the ruin it left behind. His shirt was torn, streaked with blood that wasn't his breath shallow but steady, his eyes colder than I had ever seen them. "It's over," he said simply. But it wasn't. Not really. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, the world spinning just slightly as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed. "You..." My voice cracked. "You killed them." He didn't answer right away. He walked past the bodies. 2 of them, I realized now, both dressed in black, both faceless in death, and crouched down, searching their pockets with practiced indifference. He found a phone, a ring, a folded piece of paper, and tucked it all into his coat before glancing at me again. "They would have killed you too," he said, calm, matter of fact, as though that explanation should erase the blood on the floor. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that they hadn't come for me, that this wasn't my world, that I didn't belong in this nightmare, but deep down, I already knew the truth. If I hadn't found him that night, if I hadn't dragged him into my freezer, if I hadn't opened my door when he needed somewhere to hide, I'd still be invisible. But I wasn't anymore. I was part of his story now, and stories like his didn't leave anyone untouched. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though my voice sounded distant, almost foreign to my own ears. He looked at me then, really looked, and there was something in his eyes that almost resembled regret, or maybe recognition. I'm going to finish what they started. Which means, he said softly, I take back everything they tried to steal. He walked to the window, the early light bleeding into the horizon, painting the river in muted shades of silver and gray, and I saw him silhouetted against it, tall, still, unbreakable, the kind of figure that didn't belong to the world of the living or the dead, but something in between. For a long time we stood in silence, him watching the sunrise, me watching him. It was strange, the way the morning looked almost peaceful after everything that had happened, the way the water glimmered like nothing had changed. But everything had. I had. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, but not softer. There's no going back now, Lena. You understand that, don't you? I never agreed to any of this, I whispered. No, he said, turning toward me. But you chose it anyway. I hated that he was right. I hated that he could see through me so easily, that he understood something about me I didn't want to admit. That part of me, the part that had saved him, hadn't done it out of mercy. It had been curiosity, defiance, something reckless that wanted to feel alive again in a world that had gone numb. He poured vodka into a glass, the same bottle from the night before, and handed it to me. My fingers brushed his as I took it, the contact brief but electric, and I knew then that whatever this thing was between us, it wasn't just survival anymore. He sat across from me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, and said quietly, Do you know what they call me? I shook my head. The man who kills at sunrise, he said, because I don't sleep when I'm at war. I end it before the day begins. The words hung between us, heavy and inevitable, and I realized this was who he'd always been. Not a man running from death, but chasing it on his own terms. Is that what this is? I asked. A war? He smiled faintly, a humorless, beautiful thing. It always has been, you just didn't know you were in it. I took a sip of the vodka. It burned down my throat, but I didn't wince, and looked at him over the rim of the glass. And me? What am I in this? His gaze softened then, just slightly. Collateral, he said. Or maybe the only thing I didn't plan for. Something inside me broke and bloomed at once. Fear, fascination, something dangerously close to longing. I set the glass down slowly, my heart pounding in the hollow space between us. The sun was higher now, spilling light across the room, catching the edge of his face, and for a fleeting second he didn't look like a killer or a king. He looked like a man haunted by the cost of surviving. He stood then, sliding his gun back into its holster, his expression unreadable again. We leave before noon, he said. Where? Somewhere safer, he replied, though the way he said it told me safety wasn't a place. It was a lie people told themselves to sleep at night. I wanted to ask what would happen next, what would become of me, of us. But before I could speak, he turned, the light catching on the faint scar near his temple, and said quietly, Lena, if you're staying with me, you need to understand something. What? There's no saving me, he said, only surviving me. And as the sun rose fully, casting gold and fire across the blood-streaked floor, I knew he was right. Because the man who kills at sunrise wasn't just fighting his enemies anymore. He was becoming my undoing. By the time the sun began to fade, we were already far from the river, far from the warehouse and the bodies and the silence that had settled like dust over everything we'd left behind. And the city that once felt endless now looked small in the rearview mirror, shrinking into a smear of gold and gray as we drove toward the outskirts, toward nowhere, toward whatever came next. The road stretched ahead of us like a confession, winding through fields and broken asphalt, And for the first time since this all began, I realized how quiet he was. Not the deliberate kind of quiet he used when he was calculating, but something deeper, something heavy, like even his silence was bleeding. I didn't ask where we were going because I already understood that with Adrian, direction didn't matter. Only distance did. And yet, as the miles blurred, I couldn't stop myself from glancing at him, from memorizing the profile of his face against the fading light, from tracing the line of his jaw, the small scar near his temple, the curve of his mouth that always seemed to be holding back words that would change everything if he ever let them go. We stopped when the night was almost full. The sky a dark velvet stretched above us, and he pulled into a narrow gravel path that led to an abandoned farmhouse half swallowed by vines and silence. The windows were boarded, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. But he said nothing, just killed the engine and stepped out. His movements slower now, the pain in his side catching up with him. I followed, the air cool against my skin, the smell of earth and rain sharp and clean after so many hours of smoke and city air. Inside, the house was nearly empty. A few old chairs, a table that leaned to one side, dust thick enough to muffle our footsteps. But it felt safe in that strange, temporary way that danger sometimes does, like a pause between storms rather than a real shelter. Adrian lit a small lamp he found near the fireplace, the flicker of the flame throwing long, restless shadows across the walls, and for a moment, it was almost peaceful. "Sit," he said quietly, the word softer this time. Not a command, but something close to concern. And when I sat on the edge of the table, he crouched beside an old trunk, rummaging through until he found a bottle. Whiskey this time, not vodka, and poured 2 small glasses. He handed me one, and as the amber light from the flame caught the liquid, I thought it looked like molten gold, dangerous and beautiful all at once. I drank without thinking, the burn spreading through my chest like truth, sharp and honest. And when I looked up, he was watching me, not like a man studying, but like a man remembering something he shouldn't. "Do you always drink this much?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice felt too loud in the quiet. "Only when I'm alive," he said, and the way he smiled then, slow, faint, heartbreakingly tired, made me forget how to breathe. He moved closer after that, not by intention maybe, but by gravity, the kind that pulls people together when there's nowhere else to go, and I could feel the heat of him even before his hand brushed mine. A simple touch, fleeting, but it burned like something sacred, something forbidden. I wanted to pull away. I should have. But I didn't. I just sat there, my pulse a drum in my throat, watching the way his eyes darkened when he realized I wasn't moving. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said, voice low, dangerous, not a warning but a truth he wished wasn't true. "Like what?" I whispered. "Like you're trying to find something worth saving." I swallowed, feeling the ache in my chest rise, slow and deep. "Maybe I already found it," he laughed, softly, the sound rough, almost bitter. "You don't know what you're saying, Lena. You think this is something it's not. I'm not a man who gets saved. I'm the reason people stop believing they can be." "Then why did you let me help you?" He froze at that, his expression flickering, a moment of truth caught off guard. And for a heartbeat, I thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd shut me out the way he did with everything else. But then he said, quieter than before, "Because for the first time in a long time, I wanted to see if someone would." The words sank into me like a wound and a promise all at once. I looked at him then, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see the dawn or the killer or the man who ruled in shadows. I saw someone bleeding beneath the weight of 1,000 sins. Someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched without needing to be guarded. We stayed like that for a long time, the world outside fading into a hum of crickets and distant thunder, the air between us thick with something neither of us wanted to name. The whiskey softened the edges of my fear, turned the sharp ache of everything into a kind of slow, inevitable pull, and before I could think better of it, I reached out and touched his cheek. He didn't move at first. Maybe he didn't believe it was real. But when my thumb brushed the faint scar near his jaw, his eyes closed, and he let out a breath that sounded like surrender. His skin was warm beneath my hand, his pulse steady and strong, and I could feel the tension melting from him, the armor cracking just enough to let something human through. "Lena," he murmured, and my name on his lips didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a plea. I don't know who moved first or if either of us did. Maybe it was the kind of thing that just happens, like gravity, like falling. One moment we were sitting across from each other, the next his hand was at the back of my neck, his mouth finding mine with a desperation that felt like both punishment and relief. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was fire and confession and every bad decision I'd ever been warned against, but it was real. Painfully, beautifully real. And when I kissed him back, it felt like stepping into something I wouldn't be able to escape even if I wanted to. When we finally pulled apart, the air between us was unsteady, electric. His forehead rested against mine, his breath uneven, his voice a whisper against my lips. "You shouldn't have done that." "Neither should you," I whispered back. He laughed softly then, a broken sound that felt too intimate for the space between us. "You don't understand, Lena. You don't know what loving someone like me costs." "Maybe I don't care," I said, though my voice shook when I said it. He leaned back just enough to look at me, his gaze sharp and pained. "You will." He stood then, turning away, pacing the length of the room, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to erase what had just happened, and I sat there watching him, my chest heavy with something I couldn't name. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly, half to himself. "Not with you. Not like this." "But you are," I said. He looked at me again, and for a moment there was nothing cold or cruel in his face, only something raw, something that looked almost like regret. "That's the problem." Outside, thunder rolled closer, the air thick with the promise of rain, and I could feel the storm building inside us too. Something that wasn't going to be contained by reason or fear or even guilt. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "If you stay with me, Lena, you need to understand something." "What?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "There's no going back to who you were before," he said. "Once you touch fire, it doesn't matter if you walk away. You still carry the burn." He turned then, his silhouette framed by lightning flashing through the window, and in that instant, he looked both divine and damned, a man caught between redemption and ruin. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I knew that whatever this was between us, fear, desire, danger, it wasn't going to end cleanly. It was going to consume us both. The morning after the storm didn't look like a morning at all. It looked like a bruise on the horizon, the sky swollen with clouds that refused to break. The world heavy with the kind of silence that always comes before something ends. And I remember thinking, as I watched Adrian standing by the broken window of the farmhouse, that he didn't belong in daylight, that men like him were carved from shadow and fire, not from the fragile gold that touched the rest of us. He hadn't slept. Not really. I could tell by the faint tremor in his hand when he reached for his lighter, by the stillness that wasn't peace but a kind of calculation, like his mind had already left the room and gone somewhere far darker, where vengeance waited like a patient ghost. The cigarette burned between his fingers, the smoke curling around him like armor, and I wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, to let me take care of him for just a moment. But I already knew that rest was a luxury he'd buried years ago, maybe along with the part of him that believed in mercy. He turned when he felt me watching, his eyes unreadable in the half-light, and for a second neither of us said anything, because there were no simple words left between us anymore, only truths too sharp to touch. "They called," he said finally, his voice low, even, but with that undercurrent of steel I was starting to recognize as his form of restraint. "The ones who stayed loyal? They found him." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Marco," he said, and just the name, that single word, changed the air in the room, made it colder, heavier, alive with something ancient and violent. "The man who pulled the trigger first, the man who thought he could own what wasn't his." He said it like a prayer and a curse all at once, and I realized that this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about reclamation, about Adrian taking back the power that had been stolen from him. Not because he needed it, but because it was the only way he knew how to survive. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though I already knew that too. "What I always do," he said softly, and there was something devastatingly calm in the way he said it, something that made my stomach twist, because it wasn't anger that drove him. It was inevitability. He stubbed out the cigarette, picked up his gun, checked the magazine with the same casual precision as a man buttoning his cuffs, and I realized then that this ritual of violence was as familiar to him as breathing. "I'm coming with you," I said, the words leaving me before I could think them through, and his head snapped up, eyes flashing with something between disbelief and fury. "No," he said sharply, his voice like a knife in the quiet. "I won't stay here alone," I said, my voice trembling but sure, because the thought of waiting, of sitting in that farmhouse with ghosts and silence and my own heartbeat for company, felt worse than whatever danger waited with him. "I've already seen too much. I've already chosen." He stared at me for a long time, and in that look, there was every warning he didn't have the words for, every unspoken truth about what standing beside him would mean. But there was also something else. Something softer. Maybe even admiration, though it flickered and vanished too quickly to name. "You don't belong in my world, Lena," he said finally, quieter now, almost pleading. "Then stop bringing it to mine," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved, and then he sighed, the sound heavy and tired, the kind of sigh that belonged to a man who'd stopped believing he could change anything. "Fine," he said, "but you stay behind me, no arguments." When we left the farmhouse, the air was thick with the aftermath of rain. The world washed clean, but somehow dirtier than before. The drive was long and quiet. The road winding through industrial outskirts, where the skyline disappeared behind warehouses and steel fences. And the further we went, the more I felt the weight of his silence pressing against me. Not cruel, but absolute. We stopped at an abandoned dockyard on the edge of the city, where rusted ships leaned into the fog like dying animals, and the river moved slow and cold, carrying secrets no one cared to remember. Adrian killed the engine, glanced at me once, and said, "Stay in the car." I didn't answer. He stepped out, his coat catching the wind, his posture straight and commanding, and I watched as two black cars appeared from the fog, headlights slicing through the gray. They stopped a few yards away, and men stepped out, 6, maybe 7 of them, all dressed in dark suits, all carrying the kind of quiet that comes from men who know what death looks like and no longer flinch from it. And then another man emerged, shorter, broader, his walk slow and deliberate, like he wasn't afraid. Marco. Even from a distance, I knew it was him. There was something too confident, too smug in the way he faced Adrian, like betrayal had become a habit instead of a sin. I couldn't hear their words at first, only saw the way Adrian stood still, hands at his sides, the wind catching his hair, And the way Marco smiled, said something that made the men behind him laugh. That sound, low and ugly, echoing across the empty dock. Adrian didn't move for a long time. Then, so fast I almost missed it, he drew his gun. One shot, then another. The laughter stopped. Marco fell to his knees, his hand clutching his chest, his mouth moving around words that would never make it out. Adrian stepped closer, leaned down, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Something that must have been the kind of truth that only killers exchange in the end. Then he fired again. Silence followed. The kind that isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of finality. The other men didn't run, didn't fight. They just stood there, waiting, and when Adrian turned, they lowered their heads, a gesture of allegiance, of surrender. And in that moment, I understood. This was his funeral, too. Not Marco's, Adrian's, because every time he killed, a part of him went into the ground with whoever fell, buried under the same weight of loyalty and loss. When he came back to the car, his face was pale but calm, his hands steady on the steering wheel as we drove away. He didn't speak for a long time, and I didn't ask. The air between us was thick with smoke and silence and the scent of inevitability. Finally, he said, almost absently, "You should hate me for what you saw." "I don't," I said quietly. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "You should." "Maybe," I said, my voice breaking just a little. "But I think I hate what it's doing to you more." He didn't answer. The rest of the drive passed in silence, the city lights growing brighter, the road smoother, the night quieter, and I realized something I hadn't dared to before. That love, when it comes from men like him, doesn't save. It devours. When we finally stopped outside a quiet motel off the highway, he turned off the engine and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. "You saw who I am today," he said softly. "Now you have to decide if you can still look at me tomorrow." I wanted to tell him I already had, that every time he looked at me with those eyes that carried both damnation and devotion, I saw everything, and I stayed anyway. But before I could speak, he got out of the car, the door slamming softly behind him, and walked toward the neon light flickering above the motel sign. I watched him go, my heart twisting between fear and something dangerously close to love, and I knew then that whatever this was between us wasn't built to last. It was built to burn. And I was already too deep in the fire to want to leave. The river never looked still, not really. It only pretended to be, its surface dark and glass-like. But underneath it, the current moved fast and merciless, carrying everything it touched into places that couldn't be reached again. And as I stood there on the bridge, the cold wind cutting through my jacket, the city burning faintly in the distance behind us, I thought that maybe that was what it meant to love Adrian Moretti. To be caught in something that looked calm from the outside, but was tearing you apart beneath the surface, pulling you under until the only thing you could do was stop fighting and let it take you where it wanted. He stood a few feet away from me, his silhouette sharp against the dim orange glow of the fires spreading along the docks, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched at his sides, the faint rise and fall of his chest the only proof that he was still breathing. And I remember thinking that this night, this hour, this moment, was the point everything had been leading toward, the moment where the past and the present finally collided hard enough to break something that couldn't be fixed. We'd been running again, not because we wanted to, but because the war he'd promised was finally here, the kind that didn't come in whispers anymore but in the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire. And I had seen things in the last 24 hours that didn't belong in memory. Men loyal to him dragged out of safe houses, cars burning in the street, faces I'd come to recognize turned into ghosts before I could even remember their names. And through it all, he hadn't stopped moving. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't even flinch when the bullets got too close. He just kept going, one step ahead of the men who wanted him dead, one step deeper into the darkness that had built his empire and was now trying to bury it. I followed him because I didn't know how not to anymore. I followed him even when the part of me that still knew what right and wrong looked like screamed to run. I followed him because every time I looked at him, I saw something no one else did. A man who had lost everything but refused to die quietly. A man who could kill without hesitation, but looked at me like I was the only thing left in the world that still felt real. Now, as the night stretched thin around us, I could see that same war in his eyes, not the one with guns and fire, but the one that lived inside him, the one that whispered to him in the language of guilt and vengeance and love twisted into something unrecognizable. "Adrian," said softly, my voice barely reaching him over the sound of the wind. "It's over. You've done what you came here to do. You can stop now." He didn't answer at first, just kept staring out at the river, the muscles in his jaw tightening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, a quiet storm. "You don't stop wars, Lena. You survive them, if you're lucky." I took a step closer, my heart pounding, my throat burning with words I couldn't hold back anymore. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep killing what's left of yourself and pretend it's justice. It's not." He turned then, slowly, and the look in his eyes made me forget how to breathe. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice breaking on the edges of control. "You think I wanted this? I buried my brother because of them. I buried my family. I built everything out of blood, and when I finally thought I could build something else, something worth saving." He stopped himself, the words catching like smoke in his throat. "They took that too." His eyes met mine then, fierce and vulnerable and alive with something that scared me more than the fire behind him ever could. "Don't ask me to stop, Lena. Not now. Not when there's still something left to burn." I stepped closer, close enough to see the tremor in his hands, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin, close enough to smell the faint trace of smoke clinging to his jacket. "You'll destroy yourself," I whispered, "and I'll lose you." He laughed then, but it wasn't humor. It was pain wrapped in sound. "You never had me to lose." But I knew he didn't believe that. Not really. Because if I hadn't had him, he wouldn't look at me the way he did now. Like he wanted to keep me close and push me away at the same time. Like he was terrified of what I made him remember. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of burning oil and river water, and I could see flashes of light far off. Headlights moving fast along the opposite bank. Voices carried on the air. Adrian turned toward the sound, his expression shifting instantly. The softness gone, replaced by the sharp, deadly calm that always came before violence. "They're here," he said. "Who?" "The DeSantis men. Marco's brother wants what's left of me." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Then let's go." "We can still—" "No." He cut me off, his tone final. "They'll find us no matter where we go. It ends here." He moved toward the car, opening the trunk, checking the weapons stashed inside. 2 pistols, a shotgun, a half-empty box of shells. I wanted to scream at him, to beg him not to fight, to tell him that vengeance didn't have to be the only way. But before I could, he looked at me, that same impossible, devastating look, and said, "Get down when I tell you to. And if something happens, don't," I said sharply, my voice shaking. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that broke more than it comforted. "You're a stubborn woman, Lena." "Then stop giving me reasons to be," I whispered. The first shot came before either of us was ready. Sharp, sudden, echoing off the water. And Adrian was already moving, shoving me down behind the car as bullets tore through the night, sparks flying from the metal. I heard him return fire, heard the click of the trigger, the sharp inhale of pain when a shot grazed his shoulder. But he didn't stop, didn't falter. I crawled to him, my hands shaking, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, and for a moment everything blurred. The sound, the smoke, the shouting, until all I could see was him, the man I'd saved, the man who'd saved me 100 times since, the man who refused to let death take him until he'd chosen when to go. Then, suddenly, silence. The gunfire stopped, the echoes fading into the distance, and I dared to breathe again, until I saw him. He was still standing, his gun hanging at his side, his chest rising and falling too quickly, his shirt torn and stained with blood. Behind him, the last car burned at the end of the bridge, flames licking at the sky, the reflection turning the river into a moving sheet of fire. For a moment, he looked almost godlike, untouchable, immortal. And then his knees buckled. "Adrian!" I screamed, rushing toward him, catching him as he fell, his body heavy and warm and terrifyingly human. There was blood on his hands, more than before, too much. And when I pressed my palm against his side, it came away slick and dark. He looked at me then, his eyes unfocused but still trying to find me. "You shouldn't have stayed," he whispered, the words slurred, fading. "I told you," I said, choking back tears. "I don't run?" He smiled, barely, the ghost of something tender. "That's what I was afraid of." The fire crackled behind us, the heat licking at my skin, the air thick with smoke, and I could hear sirens in the distance now, growing louder, closer. I held him tighter, my hands covered in blood, my heart breaking open in a way I hadn't known was possible. And for the first time since I'd met him, I didn't know what to do. Because I could save him from bullets, from betrayal, from everything but himself. His hand found mine, weak but certain, his fingers curling around mine with what little strength he had left. "Stay quiet," he murmured, his voice barely a breath. "And don't move." And then his eyes closed. The sirens grew louder. The bridge trembled. The fire spread. And all I could do was hold him and pray that this wasn't the end. Not yet. Not like this. Because the world couldn't end with silence. Not after everything he'd said, everything he'd fought for. It had to end with one last breath. And I wasn't going to let it be his. The world was all light and noise when they came, the kind of light that sears the edges of everything it touches, that burns through the smoke until even shadows have nowhere left to hide. And I remember thinking, as I held Adrian against me, that the sound of sirens wasn't nearly as frightening as the sound of his breathing faltering in my arms, slowing with each second that passed, each heartbeat that came too far apart from the one before it. And I pressed my hand against his chest as if I could force his heart to keep moving, as if I could will the blood back into him with nothing but desperation and love, and the refusal to let this be the end. He was still alive, barely, but alive. His pulse fluttering weakly under my fingertips, and I whispered his name over and over, not like a question but like a prayer, because I didn't know what else to give him except the sound of his name, the thing that tethered him to this world when everything else was trying to drag him out of it. The bridge was chaos now, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the river, men shouting orders, water cannons spraying, the fire still alive but weakening. And through it all, he lay there, heavy in my lap, his face pale, his lips curved into that faint, reckless half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Don't you dare leave me," I said, my voice shaking so hard I barely recognized it. "You don't get to do that, not after everything. You don't get to disappear." He opened his eyes then, just a sliver, and looked at me. Really looked. Like he was memorizing the shape of me in the light. Like he knew something I didn't. "You should have run," he whispered, his voice so soft it barely existed over the sirens. "I told you," I said, my throat closing. "I don't run." He exhaled slowly, his hand reaching up, weak but deliberate, his fingers brushing my cheek with a tenderness that felt both like goodbye and something deeper, something eternal. That's what I loved about you, he murmured. The word, loved, hit me like a bullet, sharp and final, and I shook my head, refusing to let it settle, refusing to let the past tense claim him. Don't you dare talk like that, I said, tears spilling down my face. You don't get to love me and leave me in the same breath. He smiled then, small, faint, heartbreakingly human. You saved me, he said, from them, from myself. And then, quieter still, almost as if he was speaking to himself, stay quiet, and don't move. The words were the same ones he'd spoken the night I found him, bleeding and broken in the back of the restaurant. And for a moment I couldn't tell if he was telling me what to do now or remembering what I'd done then. Either way, I obeyed, because I couldn't do anything else. I stayed quiet. I didn't move. I just held him. The medics reached us minutes later, though time had already lost its meaning. They pulled me back, their hands firm but not cruel, and I remember the way the air felt as they lifted him. Heavy, thick, charged with that strange energy that exists in the space between life and death, that fragile line where everything still might change if you believe hard enough. I followed them to the ambulance, climbed in without asking, because there was no version of this story where I let him out of my sight. The ride was a blur of light and motion and blood and hands and the sound of machines that kept counting seconds in a language I didn't understand. I sat there numb, his hand in mine, whispering his name again and again, the syllables breaking against my teeth like prayer beads snapping one by one. When we reached the hospital, they pulled him away from me, the doors slamming shut between us, the sound of footsteps, voices calling out words I couldn't process. And I stood there in the corridor, frozen, the smell of antiseptic and smoke clinging to my skin, my hands still stained red. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell. The world had narrowed to a hallway, a clock that refused to move, and the memory of his last words looping endlessly in my head. When the doctor finally came out, I saw everything in his eyes before he spoke. He's alive, he said, and I felt my knees almost give out, the air rushing back into my lungs. But it's bad. The bullet missed the heart by a margin. He's lost a lot of blood. He's strong, but he needs time. And luck. Time and luck. The only currencies the world never gives freely. They let me see him hours later, when the sun had started to rise. Not a golden sunrise, but a pale, weary one. The kind that doesn't bring warmth. Only light enough to remind you what survived the night. He looked different under that light. Fragile, almost boyish, his face free of the steel that always lived there. The edges softened by exhaustion and pain, and something that looked almost like peace. I sat beside him, my hand finding his again, and for a long while neither of us spoke. I just watched the way his chest rose and fell, slow and uneven, and realized that this quiet, this moment, was what love really looked like. Not fire, not violence, not passion that consumed everything it touched, but survival, the quiet miracle of still being here. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear, clearer than I'd ever seen them, and he looked at me like he wasn't sure I was real. You stayed, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I told you I would. He smiled faintly, his fingers tightening weakly around mine. Then I guess I owe you another debt I can't repay. I shook my head, tears blurring the edges of everything. You don't owe me anything, just don't disappear. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the window, where the morning light spilled across the white sheets like a benediction, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen asleep again. But then he said softly, I don't know what comes next. I don't know if there's a world left for me in it. There's one for us, I said. It doesn't have to look like the old one. He turned back to me then, and the look in his eyes was something between disbelief and hope. A dangerous combination for a man who'd built his life on certainty. Us, he repeated quietly, like he was testing the word on his tongue. Us, I said again, firmer this time. He closed his eyes, a slow, shaky breath escaping him, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked like he believed it. The machines kept beeping, steady and alive, the rhythm of survival. And as the light grew brighter, I rested my head against his chest, listening to the fragile echo of his heartbeat beneath my ear, and I thought about everything that had brought us here. The blood, the fire, the lies, the endless running, and realized that maybe love wasn't about saving someone from the darkness. Maybe it was about choosing to stay beside them in it, holding their hand until the night finally gave way to dawn. He stirred again, his voice faint but certain. "Stay quiet," he whispered, the ghost of a smile curling his lips, "and don't move." And for once, I didn't argue. I stayed quiet. I didn't move. Outside, the world kept turning, slow, imperfect, alive. And for the first time, I let it. Because he was still breathing, and I was still there, and somewhere beyond all the noise and the pain and the ruin, morning was breaking. And in that fragile, fleeting light, I finally understood what he'd meant all along. It was never about silence. It was never about stillness. It was about trust. About believing that even in the chaos, even in the fire, even in the aftermath of everything, there are moments worth holding on to, moments that make the world bearable again. So I held his hand, watched the sunrise crawl across his face, and whispered the only thing left to say. "I'm here." And for once, it was enough.